South Carolina Confederate Relic Room and Military Museum. But during the time when we didn't have access to our room that we use at the museum, we started having them at off-site locations, and Richland Library and here. And Jay Shree has made us very welcome, and we appreciate that. She's got coffee over there if you want some, and some water. Hey.
Oh my goodness.
Hey.
Governor?
You're really bringing in the crowd. Howdy.
This is my high school buddy.
Oh, how do you do?
We've
Good to
known
meet
each
you.
other since ninth grade. Is that here?
Okay. You want to take over?
In a couple of months, Bruce is gonna give again his lecture about the Dual Raider.
Right now? You want me to do it?
Oh, okay. I'll see you later.
Well, we don't have a big crowd today, but I'm very grateful to all of y'all for being here. I guess a lot of folks, it started on Thanksgiving or traveling or something, but I think you'll find this interesting. Something that I always like to mention before I get into the business is I've got free passes for anybody who hasn't been to the museum or hasn't been in a while and would like to go and take a friend or whatever. I think you'd find it very rewarding. Our original plans for today were for Ken Stacy, who spoke here several months ago about the Battle of Camden, the guy in the red coat uniform.
Yeah.
And he had an emergency this week. His wife had a heart attack.
Oh.
And he lives out of town. It's in either Camden or Lugoff or one of those places up there.
Yeah, he lives in the Camden area. So.
He didn't feel like he could come down here. And so Fritz Hamer, who is the retired but still active curator of history at the Relic Rooms, welcome.
Good day.
How you doing? Glad to have you. He is going to talk about something he is well prepared to speak about because he's given this before. He's going to talk about German POWs in South Carolina during the war. We had a whole bunch of them, at least 8,000 Germans and Italians, and they were here until 1946. And that is a subject which Jay Shree discovered in trying to find related books to put out. She's got some good books back there that having to do with World War II, but nothing on this subject. And so she's already given Fritz marching orders to write that book. So they can put it on the shelves here. So, looking ahead to upcoming programs, it's a little uncertain because our next speaker was also going to be Kim Stacy. And I don't know if his situation is going to be so we might have a substitution. That's on January 16th, but 2 weeks after that, we're set to have Mike Burgess, who is the 1 or 2 time history teacher of the year in South Carolina, is going to talk about Light Horse Harry Lee, which most people know as Robert E. Lee's father, but he was a very celebrated figure in the Revolutionary War. And we are still working on February and March and on from that. And so to stay in touch with that, please make sure that we have your name and email address because we send out all kinds of bulletins about these things. So now, would you please welcome Fritz Hamer?
Is this working? Yeah. Hello, everyone. Sorry, the topic has changed all of a sudden on you, but I think you'll find this interesting. Why would I be interested in German prisoners of war, our enemies in World War II? Well, back in the late 80s, I was doing research on an exhibit on the home front in South Carolina for the South Carolina State Museum. And I was looking for interesting stories to put into that. And all of a sudden, I came across references to prisoners of war in the U.S. And then I found an article in the South Carolina Historical Magazine of 1980. A historian who I knew very well had done an article about the prisoners of war in South Carolina. And I thought, how in the heck did I miss that? I mean, from the time I was pretty small, I read a lot about World War II history. And I would ask my parents questions and, about, the atomic bomb, Hiroshima, and this and that. And that topic never came up. So I was intrigued, and I started to do a little digging. I found a book that was published in 1979 by a historian at Texas A&M, Harold Cranmer, who did a national study of the prisoner of war experience in the nation. And that's still, I think, the main source if you want to know the whole story about prisoners of war. He has a few references to South Carolina, but in the whole scheme of prisoners' camps in this country, South Carolina was kind of small potatoes. And I'll mention some of the big camps as I go along here. So, war, especially World War II, a lot of prisoners were captured, especially the Germans as the war went against them by 1943. And so the first big group of POWs that were brought to this country were those captured in North Africa, the Afrika Korps, the famed Afrika Korps that had crazed havoc across North Africa all the way to the borders of Egypt until Mountbatten, and then the Americans in west of Tripoli pushed them back. And ultimately, they pushed the Germans in there, and over 250,000 Germans surrendered in May of 1943. So the question was, where were all these guys going to be put? They put them in big sort of corral barbed wire fencing early on in North Africa, but they couldn't keep them there for obvious reasons. There wasn't the logistics to look after them. There wasn't the manpower, because we were focused on the invasion of Italy by then. And Great Britain, who had prison camps, and they had somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000, that island just couldn't take them anymore. Canada had some. They had a prison camp, a few up in the Ontario area in the west. But again, Canada's got lots of room, but guess what? They have winter. And they really didn't have the infrastructure for a large number of prisoners of war. So South Carolina, or the United States, became a new center for all these prisoners to come to. And by the time Germany had surrendered, there were in the neighborhood of 375,000 German POWs in the United States in 46 different states. And a lot of these prisoners were placed in the southeast for obvious reasons, and the southwest. The climate was mild, the land was cheaper, and there were a lot of farms. And guess what was going on? By 1942, most of your traditional labor of the farms had left. Either they were drafted or volunteered for the armed services, or they went in to work in more profitable war industries. And so these, as you will see, these prisoners became a valuable source of labor. Now let's go back a little bit. In 1929, most Western countries, including the Germans and the United States, signed on to a Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War. And it's a huge document with lots of regulations and so forth. But some of the key for us today is that all enlisted personnel who are captured and imprisoned in the enemy country are obligated to work for that country for a fee, as long as it's not war industry related. And so that meant that you could employ these prisoners of war in agriculture, in the forest industry. You could employ them on military installations to do things like work in the cafeteria, to cut grass, to work on trucks, and repair and that sort of thing. And so this, as you will see, became an important new labor force that this country needed. And then you had to pay them. You were paid. The going rate in this country was 80 cents a day for any work you did. And you had to, of course, provide them adequate food and shelter. And you might say, well, what about our POWs in Germany? Well, the argument can be made that the Germans probably did more or less as best they could. But if you know a little bit about what was going on in Germany by 1942, the Allies were bombing the heck out of all the major cities' industrial centers. And so Germany's food resources, ability to provide adequate shelter were very limited. And they were not going to go out of their way to provide all the best food and so forth for Americans when their own people were often barely eating. You know, they estimate that maybe by 1943 or so, the average German was maybe getting 1,000 calories a day. And humans, on average, need at least over 2,000 calories a day to live and survive properly. So you can see that this was a... Now, you can also look at what the Germans, how they treated the Russians. They treated them pretty much the way they did in the Holocaust camps. And I remember talking to Senator, the senator who used to represent Greenwood. And you might remember Drummond, Senator Drummond. He was a fighter pilot and shot down over Normandy in July of '44 and captured. He remembers being put in a prison camp in northern Germany, and across the way were the Russians. And he said the Russians just looked, I mean, they were, skeletons. They were in horrible shape. They barely had even shelter for them, because that was the way the Germans looked upon the Russians. They were kind of like Untermenschen, not human. But at any rate, so the Americans were not treated as harshly as some prisoners. See, where was I? Where was I going with that? Well, anyway, as we begin to see prisoners coming to this country, these people are flabbergasted, because what were they being told by German news propaganda? That the United States was being bombed into oblivion, that people were living horribly. This was, of course, for their population to consume. And so this would be a common sight in many new camps, and camps that were adding prisoners. This is not South Carolina. These are prisoners being marched from the railway station in Aliceville, Alabama, which is in west central Alabama, about 40 miles west of Tuscaloosa, if you know Alabama geography. Aliceville was one of the big camps. They had over 5,000 prisoners of war by 1945. I've never been able to find a picture similar to this for South Carolina. I don't know if it was taken and somebody might have it hidden away in their collection, or we just didn't do it. I bet you somebody took a picture of it. But at any rate, this is the sight that people would seek coming to a camp often. They would usually be shipped on LSTs or empty freighters from North Africa initially over to Norfolk or maybe New York or Boston, put on trains, and then shipped west and south. And so the first prisoners to come south probably were at late summer of 1943, these Africa Corps people. And there were a lot of Africa Corps that ended up at Aliceville. And they would spend the next mostly 3 years there. When we get to South Carolina, here you see, this is the number of camps that John Hammond Moore, in his article in 1980 in the Historical Magazine, had listed. And we think there may have been more in the neighborhood of 25. We got to keep in mind, though, that some of these smaller camps were probably seasonal. They may have been set up for the fall season to provide labor to the farmers in the area, and then they might have been moved out either to another location in the state or to Fort Jackson, or maybe to one of the big camps outside of South Carolina. Camp Gordon in Augusta had a huge POW camp. I think it was on the neighborhood size of Aliceville, about 5,000. Camp Forest in Tennessee, south of Nashville, they had a huge camp. And some of the prisoners that were at these camps were sent down to South Carolina later on. Now, the first camp that I can document was here in Barnwell in September of 1943. They brought in some prisoners of war from Camp Gordon because the peanut farmers in that area especially needed labor to harvest the peanuts. Anybody here harvest peanuts before? Okay, so you know what that's like. That is not an easy task. You got to dig them out of the ground. And can you imagine what it might have been like for somebody from Berlin or Munich coming here and working, even in the fall, you know, in South Carolina, it can still be pretty darn hot and humid. And but at any rate, these folks proved to be pretty good workers, despite the climate. And many farmers wanted to make sure that they could get them back and keep working their farms, not only for harvesting, but also for maintenance, like digging ditches. Some of these Germans were good mechanics, so they could repair vehicles on the farm. All of those things were invaluable, especially since you didn't have your normal labor force. The largest camps, of course, in South Carolina were Fort Jackson, and then Camp Croft and Spartanburg had close to 1,000 by 1945. And then you see a lot of these other camps are pretty small, relatively speaking, and we don't know exactly where all of these were located. Bennettsville, they situated them at the old airfield where they had been training pilots for the war. They closed that down in 1943, and then they turned part of it into a prisoner of war camp. Aiken was a pretty large camp for South Carolina. I interviewed one through letters, one fellow who spent time there, and another one who was at Fort Jackson we'll talk a little bit about as we go along here. So this is I'm sorry about the map, it's not that good, but if you know South Carolina, you probably don't need this. You know the basic geography of the state, but you can see these red places where some of the camps were. Some of the camps were put in old CCC camps that had closed by 1942, and they could reuse those barracks for prisoners who would just have to put up a fence around them with guard towers. Now the question what about escape? There was a lot of fear when the first prisoners were coming, is that these guys could cause havoc. They could escape, sabotage industries, so forth and so on. That would be a common fear of an enemy like the Germans. But there were, of the 375,000, there's only 2,300 documented escape attempts. And virtually all of them were failures. Usually, like here in South Carolina, there was some prisoners that tried to escape from Fort Jackson. They managed to get a Jeep and tootle out, and within 2 or 3 days they were caught. In one instance, some prisoners in Charleston took a Jeep and headed towards Beaufort. And lo and behold, what were they doing? They were wearing their uniforms, their German uniforms. And they managed to stay escaped for about a day and a half, 2 days. And then some civilian thought, this is really weird. He contacted the sheriff and said, you bet it is. And he arrested him. But these are the kinds of escapes that generally happen. The most dramatic escape in the country was at Papago Park in Arizona. Most of the prisoners there were U-boat prisoners. They had been captured from their submarines. And a group of about 30 of them dug a tunnel under the fence. And while they were doing that, they built a canvas boat because they were told there was a river about a quarter of a mile away, and they could take that boat and go down the river to Mexico and be home free. So these 30 fellows got out. They all couldn't get in the boat, of course. There was a U-boat officer who was very egotistical. This was his baby. So they got to the river, and guess what? It's a trickle. In Arizona, rivers only are rivers for a few months of the year when the rainfall is very large. Well, this shows you how little the Germans understood the climate in Arizona. So that was a failure. So they scattered to the four winds, and a few of them headed up into some of the rock shelters. and managed to hold up there for about 10 days until they finally ran out of food and gave up. And all of them were recaptured. But that's the most dramatic. There was a book that was written about it that's very fun because the author went to interview some of the prisoners back in the 1980s to get their stories and about the dynamics between them and so forth. So if you ever want to find that book, John Hammond Moore wrote that as well. It's a fascinating read. Well, Helmut Rees here is one of the prisoners who wrote an extensive set of journals for a graduate student at Carolina who was doing her thesis on POWs in the mid-'80s. And then when she found out I was doing this work, she gave those to me. And these are a fascinating account of some of the things that he remembers. And he was the editor of the German newspaper that Monatblatt, I think is what they called it. And a lot of the big camps had their own newspaper. And there was also a national POW newspaper. And they would write stories about what was going on in the camp. They had big sports leagues in Fort Jackson, for example, soccer leagues, volleyball leagues. And there are, in some of the camps, I found pictures of this going on. So he wrote about this. And of course, these were heavily edited by the U.S. Army. Nothing went out before they read it, even though, of course, it was all in German. However, we did have a few linguists in the U.S. Army that could read these things. So they made sure that this was above board and there wasn't any German propaganda, quote unquote. And these newspapers are now surviving up at the National Archives. They're on microfilm. And well, I guess now they're on. You can get them on the computer. We got a bunch of them at the Relic Room for use of a possible exhibit we've talked about doing. And these are a good source of, the mentality of how people in these camps were living and what they were doing. Here it is, Monatblatt. This is a picture of Camp Jackson as it looked when he was there. This would have probably been done in 1945. And if you're wondering where that camp was located, it was located just south of Decker Boulevard. Do you know where the Richland II administrative offices are off of Decker? It was just south of that building where the camp was. Now it is all a residential area. And I've been trying for 2 years to persuade those folks to allow me to put up a historic marker. But they don't seem too excited. I've so far failed. But I'm trying to reach out to anybody who might like to help me, to get them to do that. So I've been lucky, as time goes on, to meet people that were young children or very young adults during this period. And one person I got to meet in Barnwell, her father rented the property on which the Barnwell camp was built. And thank goodness for historians like us, they took a lot of pictures. And here is the commandant's office at the Barnwell camp. And as I said, this camp was, we think, was started in the fall of 1943. And as you will see in these pictures, the accommodations in these smaller camps were not robust. They were usually, they had wooden floors and then a canvas walls and roof, because they were smaller with only 200 or 300 prisoners. And they still made it pretty good for these guys. Now we got to think about where these people had come from. First of all, as I suggested at the beginning, the food, even for German troops, had been minimal by 1940-41. Our Royal Navy had blockaded Germany, so you couldn't import food into Germany. The bombing of the cities had destroyed not only a lot of industries, but a lot of railway stations, so transport was limited. So food resources in Germany had already been significantly curtailed by the time the United States was in the war. So these guys didn't have a robust diet, to say the least. The other thing is, of course, most of them had been on the front lines or near the front lines, had been fighting the English, the Americans, and they were tired of the war because many of them had been fighting for 3 or 4 years. So when they came to this country, many of them were relieved. Now you would say, that's not a Nazi. Well, yes, that's not a Nazi, but you've got to remember most of these enlisted men came from kind of middle class families. They weren't very political, and most of them weren't really excited about going to war, but they had been drafted and they didn't have a choice. And so, yes, most of them probably fought as best they could, in part just to survive as best they could. But once they had a chance to get away, to be a prisoner, they kind of liked the situation in most cases. Now, of course, there were some rabid Nazis that were captured. And one of the problems that the U.S. Army had in the first year of the prisoner experience in the United States is, what did we Americans do? We lumped them all together. We said, well, a German's a Nazi, a Nazi's a German. Boom, they're all the same. Well, we know in this country we're not all the same, right? And so in this case, it took a while for the American leaders to figure out that, a lot of these guys probably are satisfied. We need to keep them separate from the rabid Nazis. And over time, they were able to weed out those that were very political and still very pro-German. And they tried to send most of them to Camp Elva in Oklahoma. But there were some instances where politics interfered in the camps, where some POWs were not zealous enough, or at least astute enough, to keep their politics under the rug. And this would happen in the Aiken camp. A fellow, apparently a German POW, had been communicating with the American authorities about what was going on in the camp and providing information about people in the camp that were kind of pro-Nazi. And the leaders of the prison camp got wind of this, and they apparently warned this guy to cool it. And seemingly he did not. And so one night, with lights out, a group of the Germans went into his bunk and beat him to death. And so this fellow, the American authorities managed to track down the perpetrators, the main ones, and separated them out. And ultimately, after the war, they were sent to Fort Knox and executed. There were a few other instances like this in other camps, but that's the most horrendous one here in South Carolina that I know about. So here is the camp in Barnwell. You would have probably found similar ones like this in Walterboro, in Norway, South Carolina, some somewhat smaller, somewhat bigger than this. Get a closer view. Now, some of the camps, especially like Fort Jackson and Camp Croft, where they had wooden barracks for the prisoners, these guys had time to decorate their whole yard. They would put up stone markers and gardens and all kinds of things, making them, as one Red Cross inspector of a camp in Camp Croft said, it looked like a bucolic Landswagen. It looked like some attempt to recapture their experiences at home in Germany. Just another example. This was one of these was a rec hall, and the other was the dining hall. These were the main structures that were not tents. Another look, recreation hall. Supposedly it had a jukebox in it. You might say, well, how did that happen? Well, these prisoners are working and earning an income, and they get when they want to buy something on the canteen at the camp, they use chits. They don't give them US dollars or pennies or coins. They give them chits, and they use those to pay for things. And I suspect that's how they acquired a jukebox. that everybody pooled the resources and brought this in. That would be a interesting thing to find out how that happened. And here are some of the prisoners. You notice what they would do, they would be issued old U.S. Army uniforms, and then they would paint PW on them. We managed at the Relic Room a year or so ago to buy one of the jackets from a POW camp, POW that had been in Arkansas, not too dissimilar what they had here. And that's the way, if they tried to escape, it would be pretty easy to recognize where they came from. And here they are going out to work one morning. They usually were required to work 6 days a week. At the Burnwell camp, I understand many of them worked in the forest industry, cutting timber, which was desperately needed, the pulp and paper and lumber for building things. One of the POWs that I interviewed through letters, he remembers, he was at the Aiken camp, and for about a month he was assigned to work in the forest industry. And he said that was hellacious work. First of all, it was summertime, and it was, beastly hot and humid. Second of all, there was fear of snakes, and the bugs were horrendous. So if you could, you avoided that duty. And one fellow apparently was so appalled by what he was experiencing that he deliberately injured himself so he wouldn't have to go back out. Now, how often that happened, who knows? But I can imagine some might have found it that horrendous that they would find a way not to go out and to work in the forests. And here's what this fellow supposedly was the interpreter. He spoke English and German, so he was very reliable. These smaller camps would have had just enlisted personnel. And they would have had a few NCOs who would be sort of like the leaders. And this fellow had been an NCO in the German Wehrmacht. Now, when we go further afield, looking at the larger camps and other pastimes or recreation for these POWs, because they didn't all just work every day, all day. They also, many of the camps, especially the larger ones like Fort Jackson, had classes that these prisoners could teach oftentimes, because in any army you have a variety of skills. You have people that are artists, you have people that are mechanics, and you have people, some of whom had been university professors or school teachers. And so they would hold classes in subjects ranging from English and mathematics to history of the Americas, a variety of ways. And supposedly, some of these fellows that really were serious about education managed to get certificates because of the number of classes they took and passed. So that's an interesting part of the prison experience that we wouldn't expect. But why were we allowing this? Well, our hope was, High Command, is if we treated the Germans this well, surely they would treat our American prisoners in Germany similarly. Well, as I suggested, no, they didn't, in part because they didn't have the ability to do it. But of course, as you know, when American prisoners escaped and they got caught, they faced severe punishment, many times execution. That did not happen here. But of course, we did not know that. And we just made the assumption, the hope, that by treating these enemy prisoners in the best humanitarian way, we would avoid any major retributions against Americans. And these are pictures that I got from other camps. Mississippi, you see soccer as it is today in Germany was huge in Germany in the 1940s. They didn't have the best equipment, quote unquote, but they had a ball, and if you have a ball in a field, off you go. It's very economical, quote unquote. The other thing that were on prison camps is that I told you about skilled these prisoners had. Some of them had been furniture makers, woodworkers, and in the early 90s, I met the wife of an American officer who had served at Camp Monroe in North Carolina, just above the Lexington County line. And these were a jewelry box the Germans had made for her because they got married while he was serving at Camp Monroe. And they made these and other things for them. And she had them donated to the State Museum in about 1990. And so these are real treasures to have. And if you talk about other skills, I mentioned to a few of you before we started that one of the folks that I met in Chapin at a talk I gave, his grandparents had run a farm in, maybe it was Saluda area. I might be wrong on the exact location. But anyway, they had a farm, and they employed German POWs during the war. And apparently, they got along so well, and they liked that one of the prisoners had the skills to build a mantle clock for them and gave it to them as a present. And the family in Chapin was nice enough to loan it to us, and it's on exhibit in our little World War II area. So the next time you come to the relic room, go to World War II and you'll see that clock. It's really interesting. Here is a piece of art. We don't know who the artist was, but it was done at Camp Monroe, and it looks like a scene in the Alps, either in Austria or Switzerland. Be nice to find out who that artist was. Germans, of course, did communicate with their loved ones at home. They were allowed to send postcards and sometimes letters that, of course, would have been censored, read before they were sent. But you can see this would have been a standard form that they would have probably sent home soon after they arrived at the camp. Now, maybe we're going to jump around a little bit, I guess, here. Aiken Historical Society, they put up a POW marker near the camp. It was sort of on the north end of where Aiken, the town of Aiken, is today. And that's what I want to do for Fort Jackson at some point. And Hampton Museum, they had a camp there, and they have a marker. So what happened as the war came to an end? Well, many Germans would have probably stayed if they could, unless they had lots of family back home. But by law, by the Provost Marshal Generals, they would all have to go home regardless. And so over time, initially when Germany had surrendered, in late May of 1945, politicians across the country saying, let's get these POWs out of here. We got the boys coming home. Well, the boys ain't all going to come home next month because we had to have an occupation force, and until August of 1945, we were facing the possibility of invading Japan. And therefore, all the traditional labor is not going to be back in a few months. And so when the politicians began this outcry, the farmers wrote and said, you're crazy. We need to keep these people until we know our traditional labor force is coming back. And so most of these camps were well in operation up until the end of 45, early 46. And then slowly, by the early spring of 46, they began to send large groups back to Europe. Now, many of them did not go directly back to Germany. Some of them, several groups of them, were required to go to France, to England, to Belgium, to help rebuild those countries that had been devastated by World War II. And so in some cases, they would stay there 1 to 2 years before they actually got home. And of course, when they got home, many of them, they had a heck of a lot of work to do. One of the prisoners that I wrote to had talked about how devastated his town of Wiesbaden was. And it took them several years to rebuild that city, as many cities were in devastation. I remember my mother, she went to Europe in 1951, and she remembers going through Germany and seeing the devastation that still was there. So you can imagine how difficult it was for a lot of these former prisoners to go back home. Probably their conditions were worse when they got home than had been in the prisoner camp. And many of them, as one or two of you have mentioned to me, wrote letters back to their hosts that they had worked for, thanking them for all that they had provided and asking, could you send us a care package? We're in bad shape. We need medicine, we need food, we need clothes. And I know at least some of these Americans did do that. One in particular, a fellow, son of a farmer in Marlborough County, his father had employed about 20 POWs for more than a year. And he used to he said that the food that the prison camp sent for lunch was inadequate, so he had his wife cook them big meals. And sometimes even provided them beer. Now, I don't know how impressed they were with our American beer, since you know Germans and their quality of beer. But they must have been relieved to get something beer-ish. Anyway, there were several letters, 1948, 49, describing their situation and asking for help. And many people sent them care packages that helped them get through the very hard times that were there. I'd mentioned to you that there were the prisoners that tried to escape. Virtually all of them were recaptured within a few days, but there were a few exceptions. And there's 17 documented cases where these Germans were not recaptured within a few days. There was one prisoner who had escaped from a camp in Illinois and managed to melt into life in Chicago and actually opened up a bookstore there. And as I recall, he married an American to boot. And then his identity was disclosed in the 50s. And he had to be sent back to Germany. And that would happen. Most of these people that had escaped, that spent some time, in American society, when they were recaptured, back to Germany they would go. But I know of one exception to that. This is a fascinating story. This fellow's his name was George Gartner, and he was in the Africa Corps, and his home was in East Prussia. So he came over here in the summer of 1943 and was situated in a camp in Arizona throughout the war. When they found out that Germany had surrendered, scuttlebutt throughout the camp was everywhere. And one of the worst parts of that scuttlebutt was that everybody would go back to their native town or village. Well, Gartner, guess his town was in East Prussia. And guess who that was under? The Soviets. And Germans were not keen on going back to the Russians. And so Gartner decided he had to do whatever he could to avoid that. And so he escaped from the camp in the late summer of 1945. And there was a railroad line that went by the camp half a mile or less away. He managed to escape and jump on that train and take it to the West Coast. And somehow he was in San Francisco and he found a way to get a Social Security number and find a way to work in San Francisco. He also became a part of the ski patrol, and he helped rescue a train that had been snowbound. He skied to that train and helped rescue the people there. He had a lot of other adventures. And then sometime in the 50s or 60s, he found his way to Hawaii. And he met his wife, and he became a real estate man. The story, as he tells it in his book, is that his wife was always curious about his background, and he was very evasive about it. And it was reaching a crisis point because he was so secretive. So finally, I guess in the late 70s, early 80s, he spilled the beans and said, guess what? I'm actually a former German soldier, and I've been living this lie now for 30 years. And then he contacted Harold Cramner. Remember the historian I told you wrote the definitive work on the prisoner of war experience? He called him and said, guess what? I'm George Gartner, because he mentions it in his book. And the secret is out. Well, by the 1980s, Gartner, while he might be able to understand German, he can't speak it. And he does call his sister in Germany, because his parents are long dead, and talks to her, but he can't converse in German anymore. And he gets a reprieve. He gets to stay in the United States, which makes sense, it would seem to me, after 35 years. But that's not a very common story, but it's sort of an interesting one to think that somebody could be that ingenious and stay so undercover for so long. I don't know if he could do that today. But anyhow, that is an overview of the prisoner of war experience in South Carolina. There's lots more to be said about it. And if you have some questions or comments, please. Yes, ma'am.
Remind me what you said earlier. When these soldiers were captured, the first ones in North Africa,
Yes.
how were they transported to the United States?
Well, remember now, we have a huge flotilla of freighters and LSTs that are bringing supplies and troops to North Africa. When they unload those, they're empty. So they got lots of space to put these prisoners on. And so they're put on these vessels and they're shipped back to the United States.
How long did that take? Do you know?
Oh, probably 2 weeks, depending on how bad the weather was. 2 weeks if they got the right current, maybe less than that. And there are stories that, these guys, some of them really had a rough time of it because they were bouncing all over a lot of seasickness.
Yeah.
But
What about those captured in Germany?
well, it would be the same thing. I mean, most of the prisoners that start coming over in 44 are coming from Italy and from France. And they're put on similar vessels and shipped over. Mm-hmm.
Was the same encampment used for the Japanese people? Was those camps the same as these?
Well, first of all, there is only about 5,000 Japanese POWs that came to this country. And
Well, I was in the camp. My father was in charge of getting everything out of there. And there was deep trenches all the way around. I got lost one day with my dog, 5-year-old. This is gorgeous. I mean, I walked into the building and the paintings were just like the Louvre.
now, are you talking about the internment camps for the Japanese Americans?
Yes.
Okay. That would be a little different. I mean, they had a similar setup, but they weren't quite the same as a
Well,
German
they couldn't
POW.
get out. They couldn't get out of there, that's for sure.
Where was this camp?
It was near Jerome, Arkansas.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was one of the most eastern internment camps. Yeah. I mean, there were lots of very talented Japanese Americans.
What got me in the 60s, when we were in Guam, my husband was in the Air Force Police, and they said, if you see a Japanese, they don't know the war's over, don't ask questions, just shoot.
Oh, well, there are stories about Japanese soldiers that melted into the
Yeah,
bush
they were in the caves. in
and the
Guam.
caves,
Yeah.
and they were still coming out in the 70s.
Yep.
Yeah, well, that's an unusual, but yes, it did. That happened. Yeah.
My sister and brother-in-law were stationed in Guam
Uh-huh.
in the early 60s. and
Oh, wow.
They didn't find them, but while they were there, a Japanese soldier that was in the jungle
Yeah.
found him.
Mhm.
He didn't know the war was over.
Yeah. They were living, shall we say, hand to mouth.
Yeah.
Right.
One thing I neglected to bring up, Brad, is Italians. And I'm sad to say I have not been able to find very much out about it. There is stories that there were some Italian prisoners of war here at Fort Jackson, at least until Italy surrendered in July of 43. Then you had a very complicated situation of what to do. And when I was at the Southeast Regional Archive, National Archives in Atlanta, I came across a reference to Italian former POWs being trained as soldiers by Americans to go back and fight. And I don't know what ever happened with that. It's an interesting story I'd like to investigate further. The story also goes, you're all familiar with Villa Tronco, the restaurant. The story goes that the original owner of that, would have some Italian Americans who are going to Fort Jackson come by, and they'd love to come to a restaurant because they could actually get some Italian food. So
That's how she got started.
yes, yeah. I mean, she originally started as she had a fruit stand and then a little bit of burger place, and then when I interviewed her daughter, it's about 1940. She set up the small restaurant that has built up to a much more grander place now. Yeah. Yes, Bruce.
The work that you did and are doing to try and recognize the Fort Jackson camp,
Mm-hmm.
you located where it was.
Yes.
Have you been able to locate or spent time finding out where the German POW camp at Columbia Army Air Base was?
No, I have not.
Well, one of the things I teach is the history. It's amazing to me how many people that live in Columbia, adults, have no idea that Metro Airport started out as Columbia Army Air Base.
Yeah.
It was built in 1941 by the Army Air Force under contract to try and get ready for World War II. But they had a small POW camp. You had it listed. And for those that are from the area, it turns out the POW camp is where Airport High School sits now.
Oh, is that right?
But yeah, the ball field and the tennis courts and stuff that are behind and slightly to the right of Airport High School, that was the German POW camp. And for those who want to go explore the grounds of the original Columbia Army Air Base, there's not much left. There's a couple of buildings, but if you go hunting right off this road that goes into Metro Airport, if you take a right, you'll find a flagpole. That is the original site of the original flagpole for camp for Columbia Army Air Base. And there's still a few buildings, if you look around right there by the flagpole, there's a couple of wooden buildings. Most of them have been rehabbed 2 or 3 times, but there's a warehouse and a couple of original buildings that do go back to 1943, Columbia Army Air Base.
And you can see up those pictures on the digital library for the Richland Library. They've got all those pictures that give you a good sense of, its early phases when they were building it, and then some of it's later. Well,
I got a question.
yes,
When you had the 2 postcards
yes.
that prisoner named Max something was sending home, one of them was handwritten and one of them was typed. Now, were those different letters that he sent different ways? Or I was wondering whether the typed one was a censor's version of his card.
That's a good question. I'm saying I can't really answer that.
I didn't get a good look at the dates on it, but
Yeah.
that would answer it.
Well, we can.
They had different sensor numbers on them. There was a stamp
Yeah.
on them that, yeah,
Can we tell when that was?
11170 U.S. sensor, and the
Yeah.
other 12555.
Okay, that's a different sensor. Okay.
Mhm.
So those are separate letters.
And I think those may have come from the museum at Fort Jackson. Yeah. All right. Well, anything else, sir?
Fritz, I was 12 in 1945
No way. Sorry, kidding.
and grew up about a mile from the end of what's now McIntyre Air National
Right.
Base. I remember seeing German prisoners of war working in the fields. They had no real contact with them, but
Yeah.
I mean, they would wave to kids,
Oh, sure. Yeah.
things like that. But I did see them.
Yeah, I wonder if they came from Fort Jackson or from Shaw.
I don't know.
You wouldn't know. No.
Probably came from Fort Jackson because it's a whole lot closer Jackson.
Probably, yeah.
They worked in Sandy Run too.
Oh, I'm sure they did.
Down in Sandy Run on
Mhm,
farms.
yeah.
A friend of mine said her uncle would go get them, I guess, from Fort Jackson.
Well, they were required, the farmers, they had to pay the labor for each POW was $3.50 a day. And most of that went to the government, for their upkeep. But the 80 cents they paid went to for labor. And as I do these talks and go to different places, I get little stories like that. There was a woman, when I spoke on this topic at Walterboro in August, she remembers as a young, 8-year-old, her grandmother spent every day cooking these big lunches for the prisoners that worked there. And she would serve them as this little 8-year-old. I'm sure a lot of their stories like that, they kind of get lost. The war's over, but I try to dig it up.
They wanted to forget.
Well, yeah, a lot of people did.
Because
Yeah.
my uncle, I remember when I was a child, would ask him, they don't want to talk about
Oh, you're right.
that was the past.
Yeah,
I guess
most
that's why we never heard it.
most of the World War II veterans
Talk about
I wouldn't talk about it. Even when you look at in Colombia, after the war, we have all these monuments. There's almost nothing to World War II that was dedicated right after the war. There's little monuments like the one on here, 5 points, but if you added something, it was usually to the World War I monument. There wasn't anything grand. I think that began to change when World War II veterans saw what Vietnam veterans got with that national memorial in Washington. They said, we did something too. We probably need to do something. And of course, after 50 years, people begin to look back at things in a different way, and more of them wanted to speak. So I interviewed, 30 World War II veterans in the 90s or more, and used some of it in exhibits and so forth. And
Not after they didn't want to talk about it.
No,
Now
and-
we
and-
got the war thing over there on, we got that park now.
yes, yeah, we got that. Yeah, that's something that developed in the 80s.
Yes.
But there's still not a
Long
World
time
War
after.
II monument in that park.
No, it's just to individuals, like the Columbia.
Went to USS Columbia, there's a couple others that relate to World War II, but there's not a dedicated World War II.
No, and the question is, do we need to do something grand, or do we accept what veterans really wanted? They wanted to get back to a real life after they served, and that's the question.
I want to share something like that. My father-in-law was from Memphis. He was a draftee. He got sent over. Even though after he got to England, a doctor looked at him and said, "You've got flat feet. What are you doing in this man's army?" But anyway, he was sent over there. He was he was one of those green troops in the 106th that was stationed right in the middle of the line in Ardennes.
Oh, he was right in the middle of
When
the
the German
Wehrmacht.
attack came, beginning the Battle of the Bulge, he was captured, almost that entire division.
Yeah.
And he spent the rest of the war in a German prison camp, and he would never talk about his experiences. And late in life, he had a condition where he could hardly speak, and he had to type things on. One day, he had some kind of condition that he was in the hospital, and it did something to his throat, and he could talk. He started telling war stories.
Wow.
In
Yeah.
his 80s.
Yeah.
So that was a coward.
Well, my uncle was a merchant mariner in the war, and he probably was on the Merrimack's Run, and he was in the South Pacific, and I tried to get him to talk. He said, I don't want to talk about it. No. And I tried a couple of times. Of course, it was difficult because he immigrated to Australia.
I remember my uncle, when I was little, he would have nightmares. He would scream in the night and have
Well, I interviewed an air crewman who was on a B-17 bombing the Ploiești oil fields in Romania, and he got shot down, and as he was parachuting down, he got shot in the hand, and he was in a camp for 3 or 4 months, and he had all kinds of problems. And when I interviewed him in 1990, he was still dealing with the trauma of it and trying to get the VA, he said, to give him adequate compensation. I found that hard to believe, but there are stories like that. Well, thank you all for your attention. Thanks for coming.